Good day to you. The G7 summit, which has just taken place in Cornwall, was heavily billed in advance, especially by the United States, as the moment when the United States would return to the international system and would re-establish the Western alliance on a firm foundation after the disruptive period of the Trump administration. And it was also, of course, intended to be the preparatory meeting before two other meetings, which the President of the United States, Joe Biden, is going to have in Brussels with NATO and with the EU. All of this was intended to be part of an overarching program by the United States to bring together what is now, I notice, increasingly being called the collective West in a new alliance against the power which the United States has identified correctly as the main challenger to US global dominance, which is China. So this is how the summit was intended to work out, at least from the American point of view. The reality has turned out otherwise. Firstly, the summit has been disrupted by an ugly row between the British and the Europeans over Northern Ireland and all the complex and tangled issues of Brexit. Now, the Americans must find this row a remarkably parochial affair, and given the great overarching issues that they are concerned about, that is to say, their great existential conflict with China, they must be utterly exasperated and somewhat bewildered and baffled by the time and energy their allies are devoting to it. However, it's important to say that what may seem like a trivial matter to the United States, to the British and to the Europeans, or at least to many Europeans, remains of central overarching importance. This is always the case with grand geopolitical strategies. The great power that plays them, the United States at the moment, the British Empire in its past, always discover that their grand strategies always come unstuck because the countries that they seek to move around like chess pieces on the great geopolitical chessboard have their own concerns and their own ideas, which may be more important to them than their place in the grand strategy of the great power that is trying to manipulate them. The result is that things always go askew and never turn out quite as intended. Anyway, the problems did not, however, start and end with this row over the Northern Ireland and Brexit, which I recently discussed in two other videos. The truth is that when one examines the G7 communique, the final communique, all the vast compendious pages of it, and when one looks at the new Atlantic Charter running to 605 pages, agreed by President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson of Britain, it becomes absolutely clear that there is no actual grand strategy or coherent strategy coming out of Washington or any other place in the West, whether about dealing with China or any other issue, and nor is there likely to be. Let's just look at the topics that we first had to look at, that were first discussed in these strategy documents. First of all, let's go to the G7 communique. Firstly, this is an impossibly long document. The first section of it is all about combating the pandemic. And here the G7 states are offering 1 billion doses of vaccine to the various countries around the world to combat that pandemic. Now, the figure 1 billion sounds impressive, but it is in fact only a fraction of global pharmaceutical production. And in the case of vaccines, It is in fact only the surplus of doses that would be left over once the G7 countries had completed the process of vaccinating their populations. So they're not actually making any real commitment of substance over and above what they are able to do without diverting any further resources from themselves. I have to say also that though 1 billion sounds impressive, the international agencies, the IMF, for example, reckon that the true number of doses that would be needed to deal with the pandemic on a global scale would be more like 11 billion than just 1 billion. In other words, what is being offered is around 10% of what the IMF needs. Now, I say all of this. I understand that there are some people who follow this program who question whether any kind of inoculation is needed at all. And of course, there's some people who are opposed to inoculations on principle. All I'm going to say about that is that the G7, the IMF, and all the rest accept that inoculation is needed, or they say that inoculation is needed. If you accept that view, if you go along with that view, then what they're offering is nowhere near enough. And that is all that matters in trying to assess an offer of this kind. It looks good on paper. When you unpack it, it means nothing. The same goes for other parts of the communique. There is a huge amount about climate change. Climate change is an important issue for the Democrats in the United States. They talk about it all the time. Some of the parties in Europe talk about it. The Green Party in Germany, of course, is all about climate change. Ecological concerns are very widespread. Again, I understand and accept that there are many people who no doubt follow this video who question all of this, but that is the consensus that these powers gathered in Cornwall have committed themselves to. What do they actually propose, however, to do about it? Well, all the same things that they're doing already. In other words, there is nothing here that is really new. Then there is the question of economics. And what one finds is that the G7 countries remain committed to the same amount, the same policies of massive spending, which we've been seeing over the last few weeks and which were initiated in a serious way after the new administration was inaugurated in January, but which have their roots in the start of the pandemic last year, when the financial institutions, the central banks, responded to what looked like an economic crisis by putting their foot down on the monetary accelerator. All one can say from looking at this G7 communique is that that foot is going to remain on the monetary accelerator, even as inflation rises practically everywhere. And there seems to be no ability to rethink the strategy or to look beyond it or to adapt to the problems that are starting to build up in the international economy. But there we go. That's the pandemic, climate change, and economic policy. All important issues, all overarching issues, perhaps the sort of issues that the G7 ought to be discussing and which ought to be its primary focus. But, as I said, the purpose of this meeting, as it was billed, was otherwise. It was to bring together the Western alliance and to put together a coalition of democracies against China, which the United States sees as the great overarching rival. Well, what does the G7 communique say or do about that? Well, the answer is not very much. And here apparently the Americans were disappointed because they discovered that though they are very keen on standing up to China, their European allies are altogether less keen. Germany, for example, sees China as its major trading partner. It doesn't want to disrupt its economic links with China. President Macron of France also wishes to maintain, at some level, at least a good relationship, or at least a cordial relationship with the Chinese. Apparently, he annoyed the Americans a great deal by saying that, well, the last time he looked at a map of the North Atlantic, he could not find China on it. Well, that is typical Macron, the kind of clever comment which actually, when you think about it and take a step back, always lands him into trouble. But in fact, ultimately, it does point to a fundamental truth. As far as the European countries are concerned, China is far away. They don't really perceive it as any kind of threat to themselves, and in fact, more and more of them tend increasingly to see it as some sort of economic partner. German industry does not want to sacrifice its exports to China, and other European countries are keen on Chinese investment. There isn't the same urgency about China as there always is about Russia. It is always easy for a European or Western statesman to work up the European powers into a froth of anger against Russia on some issue or other. The Russians are, after all, neighbours of Europe. For much of their history, they've been part of Europe. So they are widely seen by many Europeans as an adversary, as an enemy, as an existential threat, as the bear on the door which must be kept out. China, by contrast, is just too far away to worry about and concern about and fret about in exactly that sort of way. In reality, if you scratch many Europeans hard, you will find that below the surface, what they would far prefer is for the United States to stop worrying about China, come to some kind of deal with China, except perhaps that the Chinese will overtake the United States one day and focus instead on who the Europeans always like to see as their true enemy, which is not China but Russia. And that's shown very amply and clearly by the G7 communique. The words about China are mumbling and incoherent. There's some comments about China needing to show transparency and needing to avoid engaging in uncompetitive practices. There's some mumbling words about the Uyghurs and human rights violations, but notably the word genocide does not appear. By contrast, Russia, with which the G7, under American pressure, now seeks a predictable and stable relationship, is still excoriated as an aggressive, disruptive power intent on destabilization, threatening Ukraine and doing all sorts of dark and wicked deeds all around the world. It's always easy, as I said, to work up a European consensus against Russia. Against China, it is proving to be far more difficult, and perhaps in practical terms, it is impossible. So the Americans will have come out of this G7 summit frustrated and disappointed. The other thing they've been trying to do, of course, is that since they recognise that China is not, for the Europeans, quite the great focus of attention and interest that the Europeans, that the Americans would like the Europeans to perceive it as, they've been talking up the issue of human rights. Problem is, again, Europeans can get very exercised about human rights violations, real or imagined, in Russia and in places like Ukraine and Belarus. But ultimately, when it comes to China, again, China is too far away and too culturally different for the Europeans to really care. Moreover, when one looks at the sort of countries that are ticked off in the G7 communique and criticised for their human rights violations, countries which, along with Russia, include Myanmar, Belarus, and the rest, it's irresistible to feel that once again Western concerns about human rights, or to be more precise, American concerns about human rights, are incredibly self-serving and selective. Lots of American allies, after all, engage in egregious human rights violations. I mean, one doesn't want to start, for example, with countries like Egypt or the Gulf monarchies, but they're most unlikely to find themselves the target of criticism from the United States, and there is no pressure from the United States to label them as human rights violators in G7 communiques. The result is that the countries which are always and invariably criticised for human rights violations are the US's rivals or opponents. Now, that is something which perhaps many Americans are happy with, perhaps some Europeans are, but internationally, around the world, it is a very self-serving thing. It creates a very poor perception of the whole human rights issue as it is used by the West, and it reinforces that concern which I discussed in a recent video I did, in which I discussed what the rules-based international order we hear so much about from the West is really all about. It is seen by many people, human rights are seen by many people, as simply something the West conjures up when it wants to interfere in their internal affairs. Anatol Lieven, one of the most astute commentators on international relations, recently said that when it comes to human rights, American interest flicks on and off like a strobe light in a sleazy disco. Well, perhaps that's a rather vivid metaphor, but it is one which many people around the world will quietly share. So the result is a G7 communique which ultimately doesn't amount to very much. And if we turn to the new Atlantic Charter, produced with such bombast by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, one sees again the problem. Because, of course, the original Atlantic Charter, agreed in 1941 at the height of the Second World War by President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States and Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain, was a great rallying call of the Western democracies, which were at that time in conflict with Nazi Germany. And it was a commitment to democracy, free trade, human rights, and a new system of international relations based on equity and peace. It was something that was necessary in order to persuade Americans especially that the struggle that was at that time underway in Europe, and in which Japan and the United States would soon join, really was an existential issue, one which really did affect Americans and who they were and what they were about and what their country was all about. By contrast, this vast hodgepodge of a document, this new Atlantic Charter, is just an incoherent list of talking points and aspirations, none of which is going to come together to make very much sense. Certainly, it does not provide anything that remotely approximates to a program, one which people can rally to in the way that the original Atlantic Charter of 1941 did. And the same is true of this great infrastructure program in rivalry to China's Belt and Road Initiative, that the G7 countries, on US initiative, have now committed themselves to. I say committed themselves to because, of course, in reality, they have done no such thing. There have been any number of promises at G7 summit meetings to do something about increasing investment in the countries of the global south. I can remember back in the 1990s at the Gleneagles summit, the G7 summit that took place in Gleneagles in Scotland, Tony Blair, at that time British Prime Minister, talking about the importance of a massive program of investment and development in Africa. Well, what became of that? Very little. In fact, the major investor in Africa in the years which followed was not the G7, it was China. And it is China which has been increasing its presence in Africa and which continues to do so. So here we have a new program, a new infrastructure package, which, just like those commitments made all that long time ago, in the 1990s in Gleneagles, is another repetition of the same platitudes, the same astronomical numbers. The figure $40 trillion is being talked about, but nothing really of substance, nothing coherent that anybody in the global south can work with and which might persuade them to realign with the United States and against the Chinese. And I'm going to say something else about this infrastructure program. It doesn't actually look to me very much like an infrastructure program. It is completely unclear how it is going to be funded. But to be straightforward about it, from what I have read about it in the document, it resembles more the kind of European Union slush funds, like the so-called structural funds, which are so much a feature of the European Union system. These are funds which the European Union distributes to various member states, purportedly in order to carry out various developments in their countries, but which invariably end up in the pockets of contractors, some of whom are from the rich countries and of the north, and also into the hands of political leaders in the south. Very little actual useful infrastructure is built as a result, though it is true that you will find lots of roads, lots of bridges, lots of railways and all the rest, much of which is of dubious utility. To the extent that this is a fund like that, well, given the endemic problems of corruption in the global south, I can see why it might be attractive to some political leaders, and it might indeed buy their support, but it is not ultimately going to change either the broader economic geography or the geopolitical balance. I would say that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative anyway is misunderstood and diverts attention away from the place which is of real central interest to the Chinese, which is Eurasia, that vast territory which includes Russia and Central Asia and the Arctic, which is now the primary area of Chinese, the primary focus of Chinese economic involvement and, if you like, expansion. What the Chinese are trying to do, and they're getting support from their Russian ally in order to do it, is to integrate this gigantic Eurasian economic space to make it effectively into one single self-sufficient economic and political bloc. Now, that is a coherent plan, and it is being executed in a systematic and methodical way. This infrastructure fund, slush fund, bribe system, if you wish, isn't in any way going to compete with that. It's simply another way for the United States to dole out funds to various political leaders that it likes around the global south in order to get them to vote its way in the General Assembly of the United Nations. It will make no substantive difference to international relations. The Chinese will forge ahead with their very real programs, and the United States instead will find itself doling out funds to corrupt politicians around the world who want them. And here we come back to the underlying problem. Because if you really want to do something that might genuinely cause the Chinese concern, which might put a spoke in their wheel, then what you really need to do is to find some way of getting the Russians to distance themselves from the Chinese. Because given that the Chinese objective is this program of Eurasian construction that I've just discussed, the Chinese need the Russians as a partner to complete it. Without Russia, it cannot be done. The Russians, for the moment, are fully committed to this Chinese strategy because they see it in their interests to press on with it. But if you really want to disrupt this strategy, what you really need to do is to draw the Russians away from it. Now, there are some people in Washington who seem to have some sort of conceptual understanding of this. But the G7 summit, again, cuts in the opposite direction. Because, as I have said, whilst it is easy to rally Europeans and Americans' allies in Europe against Russia, it is very difficult to get them to focus on China instead. So we've ended up with a G7 communique, which does the opposite of what I suspect the United States would like it to do. Instead of being harshly critical towards China and opening the door, if only slightly, towards Russia, it does the opposite. It says mumbling words about China, which the Chinese will just brush off and ignore and indeed laugh at. And by the way, they are already laughing. And it offends and insults the Russians in extraordinary ways, continuing to speak of Russia as almost an international brigand and siding with Ukraine, for example, against Russia in a way that the Russians must find completely exasperating. So, whilst at the one hand, it calls for a predictable and stable relationship with Russia, its language is such as to confirm to the Russians that in deciding to align themselves with China, they've made the right choice. So this has been a G7 summit which has produced none of the outcomes that the United States was seeking. I understand that the Americans are actually very disappointed by the outcome of the summit. They are exasperated, as I said, by this row between the British and the Europeans, and they're also frustrated by their inability to get the G7 to agree to a really strong and resounding communique condemning China for all its various transgressions, real and imagined. Behind all of this, there is, I suspect, an American understanding that by themselves they simply do not have the power any longer to withstand Beijing. They need their allies to work with them in order to do it. And they must be deeply frustrated that their allies are showing no interest in doing it. Well, I'm going to finish this long video by making one very general observation. I think it is hopeless for the United States to try to build a league of democracies against the league of autocracies led by China. That is not a strategy. That is a cliche. And the great problem of US policy at the moment is that it is all about cliches. This idea that the United States can take on China and Russia at one and the same time is clearly a hopeless one. But this idea that the United States can somehow draw Russia away from China is an unrealistic one. And the idea that the United States can rally the world against China is equally unrealistic. Unrealistic policies always, in the end, fail. It is folly to persist with them, at least in that sort of way. Rather than try to engage China in some sort of pointless Cold War, where the odds now are becoming increasingly stacked against the United States. What the United States needs to do instead is to reconsider its entire relationship, not just with China, but with the world as a whole. It needs to accept that this long period that started at the end of the Second World War, with the United States as the dominant world power, influencing events in every corner of the world, has essentially ended. The United States remains the world's most powerful country and will continue to be so for some time, but it operates within a different geopolitical environment. What it needs to do, far from trying to unite the world against China, is focus instead on its own domestic problems, which are becoming acute. Those are being sacrificed in this quixotic quest for maintaining global dominance, a global dominance which is passing. It needs to move forward with developing programs to rebuild its domestic industries. It needs to do so in a way that is not focused on some sort of pointless competition with China, which it cannot win. It needs to rein in its military spending, and it needs to accept that many things are going to happen around the world, which it may not like, but which it cannot control. For example, it needs to accept that the reality is that the Western Pacific, the regions along China's coastlines, are areas which are going to be dominated by China, and it needs to understand also that Ukraine, for example, is undefendable and has turned out to be a disastrous investment of American resources and not worth antagonizing Russia over. It needs to start making these tough-minded but realistic calculations in its own interests. If it does that, then it can come to some kind of modus vivendi with the other great powers, and it will be able to do so whilst remaining a crucial player in the international system. But if instead it persists with these misguided policies of confronting China, confronting Russia, interfering everywhere and all the time over everything, goosing up its GDP by reckless money printing in order to maintain the illusion of its own economic supremacy, then sooner or later, perhaps sooner rather than later, it will run out of road and it will crash. Well, there it is. On that rather pessimistic note, I'm going to end this video. I hope you can join me on future programs on this channel. I would also ask you to check out our main channel, The Duran, where I make programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check us out on our main channel, to check out Alex's channel, which you can also find links to. And please check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. Also, don't forget to go to our Discord server and check out our shop and see the amazing things that you will find there. Lastly, please remember that we accept donations via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And please do press the like button on this video and check your subscription to this channel. Have a wonderful day, and I hope you will join me again for a future video on this program, on this channel, and thank you again for joining me today.